Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Lights Too Bright podcast. Today, I have a guest who I've known for years and years and years, mainly through reputation. And I've only physically known him for about the last 10 years because we've become, well, he's a friend of a friend, as with many people in optometry. And then we hang out, and from his reputation, I was a bit worried, but he's not too bad. He's not too bad. I don't think I've ever shared the story with him of how I know of him, and I probably will. So, without much further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Nicholas Rumney. Hey, Nick, how are you?
Yeah, good. It's an interesting times at the moment.
Yeah. And that's a different podcast, and that's if you want to travel across the Atlantic. We may need to.
Oh no, I was thinking about it's different times for me because this time last year I was still going into practice, examining eyes, having a look at things, writing prescriptions for drugs, fitting lenses, doing all that.
So,
sort
what
of
do you
stuff.
do now, Nick? Why has this?
What's changed is over a period of about 4.5 years, I have gradually phased an exit strategy. And it's something that we really began to target maybe 20 years ago within the practice. So quite a long haul, but that was always the vision. So July 31st, 2025, I finally retired from the practice BBR Optometry, where I've been working for the last 34 years. I joined in September of 1991. And since I retired, I have retained big interest in optometry. About 2 Sundays a month, I pop into a local private ophthalmology unit that is doing cataract waiting list work. We do some cataract consenting, and I have a YAG laser clinic. So the nice thing is, having retired out of the practice, I am actually practicing at the top of the game that we've all been involved within for so long. So it's great, not backed off.
So you've not really completely retired. You've just stepped away from the practice, and just doing other really interesting things.
Yeah, I mean, I've still got a position on the investigation committee for the GOC, which is not commonly used, but is really used more to do, let's say, less with things like clinical or conduct issues, but more to do with health type issues when somebody has self-referred because they're concerned that they're able to cope with the stresses of practice. And that's where it's really nice to put, 30 years of experience of all the different things we've had going on in the practice. We've had a little bit of everything. So good to put some of that back. And I do a little bit of consultancy for a couple of companies that also would benefit from that experience. But obviously, as I step back from day-to-day regular primary care optometry, that skill set is going to be of less interest because I'll rapidly fall out of date because things change rapidly.
Yeah, but you're the kind of person who likes to keep up to date. You always seem to be traveling and you're still conferencing and stuff. So I think it'll be some time before that happens. Let's go back to the beginning. Excuse me. Did you always want to be an optometrist, Nick? Was that your goal in life?
Well, you might think in some respects I didn't have a lot of choice. My grandfather was an optometrist. He basically lost his job during the First World War and couldn't go home without a job, walked into an optical practice as a jobs runner. He was going to cycle jobs across Birmingham for lesser brother. And after a few months or years, he was invited to step up to the plate as a dispensing optician and then started doing eye examinations before there were even exams to be an optometrist. And then my 2 uncles, his eldest sons, they went into manufacturing. And my father, whose kind of education was disrupted in wartime, he wanted to be an engineer. He wasn't left with a whole lot of choice, and he ended up going to Aston College at the time, qualified in 51, and I was born in 58. And then I guess I might not have done it, but for the fact that around about age 5, I had a major eye injury to my right eye. So I then spent many formative Monday mornings with Dad taking a day off practice, taking me down to the ophthalmology unit so they could have a look at the damaged eye, which was ultimately nucleated when I was 14. And I suppose I was just immersed in that whole area. In the end, I probably wasn't a hard worker, so I didn't make grade to go for better quality A-levels. And in fact, I didn't even get the A-level grades for optometry first time round. I had to repeat. And that took me to Cardiff in 1977. So that's where it all started.
That's actually that brings me nicely round to that comment I made at the beginning. So Cardiff was where I kind of your name really stuck. I was doing PQEs and you were examining at Cardiff, and we stepped out of the final set whenever they were, and I'd had dispensing as my last PQE session, and so had one of my colleagues, one of my good friends, and I was saying, they made life really easy for me. They were like, it's the last exam it's been a busy 2 days. It's the last exam, and they asked me stuff to do with like transitions and UV levels above tree line. And it wasn't overly complicated. And my very good friend was like, got Nick Rumney, didn't I? Asked me to do prism controlled bifocals and calculate the power. And that's when your name first flagged. And I was like, okay, then. But he did all right. He got through in the end. But it's interesting. And you know this, what a small world optometry is. So after you graduated, pre-reg? I guess it was pre-reg then.
Well, if we just go back a fraction,
yeah.
When I was 14, my dad kind of said, look, his brother was looking for someone to work doing some cut edge and fit work but it was the Dudley Optical Company at the time. So I went down there, and for the princely sum of £1.50 for a Saturday morning, I would work, and I did some half terms as well. So by the time I got to optometry school, not only could I versimeter and lay up a lens, I could surface a lens, I could cut a former, and I could glaze a lens, and I could neutralize. So dispensing practicals were mostly talking about how to weld up the sills on my Mini with Richard Erlen. We didn't do a lot of dispensing at that time. And to be honest, that's continued. I continually surprise my DO colleagues with a level of understanding of lens manufacture that I think is not that common amongst the more kind of clinical optometrists around.
And I was going to say that I think the emphasis has changed. When I qualified, I'm 25 years qualified now. When I qualified, there was a heavy dispensing element to our degree. And I was at City, and we made frames and we learned all the glazing, and we had to glaze, and obviously not as in depth as the dispensing optician course, but there was a heavy element of that. I don't know, and this is more because I've not been involved in university education in for many, many years. I don't know if the current crop get that level of education. I think we have shifted very clinically, which is not a bad thing. But I don't think they get that grounding in dispensing that we did. And I didn't get it as well as you did, as Brian did.
I think you might be right, but we have to recognize the fact that the skill set of DOs these days, and I've watched, I think our practice was into our 6th trainee DO, so I've watched them train, and then I've helped DOs come into the realms of becoming a CLO or specializing in low vision. So their skill set is vastly under-recognized by the population, and it's under-recognized by optometrists as well. So the fact that it's maybe become a little bit more theoretical and a bit less practical within our optometry school is an inevitability as we turn our attention to other things. I do think that whatever else we do, if we can't, as our practices, turn out somebody wearing an entirely appropriate, well-fitting appliance that gives them maximum visual benefit, I don't care whether it's a sterile lens or a pair of rimless transitions, we are somehow failing. And just being able to happen to spot some obscure, pathology doesn't negate from the fact that, that's really where the bread and butter remains and will be. And we should be proud of it.
And also, and you know this as well as I do, that the general public, unfortunately, for the most part, still think of us as people who provide spectacles as well as contact lenses. And so you're right, we should be able to provide a good product that maximizes a patient's optical capabilities, as and you need the people who can do that.
You do. You absolutely do that. And that goes, right through the entire team, the kind of the clinical assistants as well. And in developing that position, that public, I guess, not status so much as public understanding, I was very fortunate to come under the wings of the then head of school in Cardiff, who which was the first optometry school to actually call themselves the School of Optometry or the Department of Optometry. It didn't add in vision science, which some have, and that's a decision that you take. But we were not graduating with a degree in ophthalmic optics. We were graduating with a degree in optometry. And Michel Millido, who was the head of school at that time and had built a team of really young, PhD-driven lecturers, had a big influence coming from his time in the United States and Canada. And he got into lots of trouble with the powers that be that wanted to retain the title of ophthalmic optics. So I embraced that optometry title really, really early on. And it's, I think a very important component that I will, stand up on my soapbox and argue for the terminology for as long as it takes. And I think it's interesting that, when you look at the technical produce that comes out, say, from the Royal College of Ophthalmologists, and they've become so much more in tune with what we want to do for our patients, they are the ones, in many respects, that are driving the use of that title correctly. And often it's ourselves that is ambiguous, using the term opticians as a catch-all. I don't like that.
And I mean, we can go down the whole politics of power and advertising and the power of advertising. And, we're on the same page. We sing from the same hymn sheet with regards to the use of
And I
using
think
the appropriate terminology.
The other element to that is coming from where I went after I completed my training in the UK. So you were about to ask me about pre-reg.
Pre-reg, yeah.
Yeah. Well, with a parental background in a practice, it was always the kind of, well, you're going to go back and work with your dad. And I thought, well, he probably doesn't want to work with me. And there's always that practice base going on in the future. I think I'm going to go for a hospital position. And I set my sights on applying for the new position that had only just been created in 1980, which was just as I was graduating, which was at Bristol Eye Hospital.
Okay.
And I think one of the things to bear in mind at Bristol Eye Hospital was that during the final year of the third year of the Cardiff optometry degree, you spent a week over in Bristol, in digs, and going into the hospital and being posted into various different sort of clinics. And at that time, Bristol probably had one of the best reputations for the early days of shared care. There was a diabetic monitoring scheme that had been established with the community. The community CE was absolutely amazing. Once you started your pre-reg year, there was a lecture pretty much every month from really good, solid clinicians. And I used to go along to all of those, got me the sort of flavor for CE, I suppose. And the other thing was that I came under the wing, and this is probably the themes that might go through my career. I came under the wing of somebody else, a chap called Fred Giltro-Tyler, who was the principal optometrist, senior optometrist at the time at Bristol Eye Hospital. He'd trained over in Colchester, which was another well-developed optometry department within the hospital eye service. Had come to Bristol. I was his first pre-reg. And we had our ups and downs, but by and large, it gave me a massive grounding in all sorts of things, from keratoconic fitting, extended wear soft lens, looking for things like, I don't know that many other optometrists would have known what an infiltrate was in 1981. And so, we can make this theme. Michelle Millado was a big influence in Cardiff, Fred Giltro-Tyler in Bristol. The contact lens practitioner in Bristol was a chap called Richard Waugh. And Richard Waugh had a really interesting history because he was just in that tail end of World War II generation. He'd flown Spitfire. So you imagine what we talked about.
Yeah.
He liked his sports cars, and he taught me the geometry of the contralateral offset Nissl lens, where you could change the back surface curves of a lens without a transition zone. And this in the days when you were fitting PMMA lenses. So old school. These great people gave me huge influence.
And I think because your story is good, but I just want to just break up a little bit. I think a running through a theme throughout this series is the community of optometry, but meeting people and how that impacts professionally, how that's impacted people. So everyone I've spoken to has basically gone, well, I met someone and they helped me, or they made me progress. And I think, you've reinforced that, is that there's always a bit of fortune, a bit of luck in terms of who you meet. You do have to make that yourself. You do have to go out and search for that. If you just sit in your room and do not venture out, it's harder to make those acquaintances that can inspire you to be a better practitioner, diversify what you want to do.
I absolutely agree. And, one of the nice things about working in the hospital environment, and I think one of the cultural things we've tried to develop within our practice, is it's quite a large community. Now, obviously, you've got to dial in social life when you plonk yourself in an eye hospital with 6 consultant ophthalmologists and a whole team of optometrists, nurses, etc. And I met people there in the world of ophthalmology who I could see, well, they don't have 2 heads. They are quite amenable human beings. And I've stayed in touch with many of them. One of them, for example, was instrumental in getting me to go out and spend 6 weeks working in a volunteer clinic in Jamaica one summer, which was incredibly educational. And this chap, again, one of my influencing characters, I think I influenced him. We've stayed in touch for the best part of 40 years.
And it's nice. I was looking through some of my highlights of 2025, and Hans basically went, I've done a lot of things. I've worked in a lot of jobs, but optometry is really friendly. And
Yeah.
he goes, I don't think I've worked in an industry where the eye care professionals are really friendly. Let's keep moving on.
Yep.
You've pre-regged in Bristol at the hospital.
Yep.
And then you decided you still didn't want to work with Dad.
No, I didn't want to work with Dad. The first thing I wanted to do is buy a bigger motorbike. So I did. And then the massive snowfall, interesting, it's current at the moment, but the massive snowfall that hit Bristol and the south of England in kind of 1981, 82. That was interesting. I took a job with a small optometry practice that really taught me that if you were resting on your laurels, then you weren't really going anywhere. And sure enough, that practice no longer exists. It didn't last much longer after that. They were nice people, but equipment levels were low, level of investment was low. They didn't have a vision. And I was only really doing it, just so that I got a bit of experience. I bumped into an ex-girlfriend who telling me that she was thinking about going out to Australia and there was a possibility of getting a master's degree out there. And I thought, oh, okay, that sounds interesting enough. And she was still in training. I wasn't. I was qualified. So in the old days, there used to be an appointment diary on most optometry reception desks called the optical yearbook. And the optical yearbook had a day and you used to mark it out in sort of 9 o'clock, 9:30, 9:40, whatever, for your appointments. And they were all handwritten, of course. But at the back was a glossary from the International Optometric and Optical League, the IOOL, of all of the optometry schools around the world. And I picked up the addresses of the Australian schools and wrote to the three heads of department, and one of them wrote back. And this is a chap called Barry Cole, who, again, a seminal influence on my career. He kind of said, yeah, we'd be interested in you coming out here. It sounds like you've got some interesting early years experience within the hospital. There were no such thing as hospital optometrists in Australia at that time. In Melbourne, Victoria had only just got diagnostic drugs legislation, and obviously we were qualified in diagnostics. So we managed to do a bit of, shenanigans with visa and application and getting funding. And in June 1982, just as the Falklands War was coming to an end, I scooted off to the other side of the world and landed in Australia in June 82. Yeah, big change.
How long were you out there for?
Well, when you talk to me, you'd almost think I'd been there for years. Okay. But when you add it all up, it was just shy of 3 years, about 2.5 years. Yeah. But such an influence that, if we'd be sitting in a bar and I've had a couple too many beers, I can start going up at the end of the sentences and the accent just kind of comes back. So I spent 2.5 years there. I came into contact with some, again, absolutely amazing people. We had a lot of fun. People like Noel Brennan, who's just retired from J&J, but I knew him when he was working with Nathan Ephron. Barry Cole, Leo Carney, all sorts of individual characters. Michael Kaliniatis, who was working ultimately in New Zealand and then back in Sydney, and he's now back in Houston. John Sidoroff and Sarah Sidoroff, people that are now up in Huddersfield. It's, as you say, it's been very much a people-based profession, both the ones that are sitting in the chair in front of you, and I like to get to know them, and the people you meet. And the way I tend to approach it is you've almost got two sorts of interactions you have. You have transactional interactions, you people that come and go and you do the best for them and they become your friends or they become your patients and etc. But second type is you have what I would call transformational interactions, where you get to meet somebody who changes the way that you think and perceive about the world around you. And characters like Barry Cole, characters like Brian Holden. When I arrived in Australia, he didn't know me like a bar of soap. He had no idea who I was. And yet 10 years ago, we put on the Myopia Day at the BCLA when I was conference organizer. And Brian was happy to come over and speak, and the likes of Kate Gifford and Ian Flitcroft as well. And so these are people that I can look back over a 40-year career and say, well, they're my mates, actually. They're really good friends. And I was there when they were really young, so I know where all the bodies are buried and all the skeletons in the cupboard as
It's
well.
why they're so nice to you, Nick. It's why they're so nice to you. It's why they keep buying you drink.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I've done it. I've done the abroad thing. What would you say if you had to pick one or two things from being abroad, when you came back for whatever reason you came back, what would you say were the things that were different that made when you came back, you went, this is what I want to do different from when I left?
I think there's a couple of things. There's one that's a personal and social thing. I was a student in Australia on a graduate visa, which meant that I was an immigrant in somebody else's country. And you were acutely aware that, you didn't have a right to be there. And so, obviously we behaved ourselves, but it's not that. It's just, there is a cultural significance to migrating somewhere, living somewhere under a different, although the culture in Australia is not dramatically different, but it is a slightly different feel. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I bought into what everybody would know as the Australian sort of tall poppy syndrome. And that basically says that you you question authority until you've had it proven to you that what is there in authority is right and proper and there justifiably rather than just by precedence. And I think that's something that the Australians were very, very good at. So when I came back, there was an awful lot of, well, that's not been invented here. Okay. We're not doing that here, or that's what they might. And of course, by the time I came back from Australia, I'd been exposed to the American speakers that had come to the clinics and come to the educational meetings in Melbourne. And then on my way back from Australia, I spent time visiting people like Ian Bailey in Berkeley, Brian Brown in Smith Kettlewell in San Francisco, or Sam Janensky in Santa Monica. I went to lots of different clinics, etc. I visited Waterloo back in the day. And so I arrived in the UK thinking, well, if we think we've got this world of optometry sussed, we need to take a long, cold, hard look at ourselves because everybody else has a different target. And we're not really approaching that at the moment. And you'd have seen that from New England as well, I'm sure.
For me, it was a real eye opener in a sense of what optometry could be.
Yeah.
Versus from what I had left. And I was fortunate enough that when I came back, IP had kind of got past. So I was able to kind of jump on that quite quickly and use a lot of the stuff that I picked up in the US and bring it back. But I agree with you. I think if any, I will get patients, and I get patients who come in and they're getting ready to go off to university or at the tail end of university. And I'll say, if you get the opportunity to live abroad, go and live abroad. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they don't speak the same language, whether they do speak the same language. You went to Australia, I was in the US, both English speaking countries, but the growth you will get from living abroad, you can't get from just staying within the UK. Professionally as an optometrist, to see what level of care you can offer safely for the benefit of your patients without having to refer them really is an eye-opener. So when you come back, you want to go, I want to achieve this. I want to do this, not just for my patients, but for me, so that I can keep interested and engaged in making sure I'm providing the best, not only optical care, but physical care for ocular health. And I think that is huge.
It
I think that
is.
is huge.
I mean, the big influence, there were a number of influences, but one of the big influences to me in Australia was when I met Lou Catania, who came out from then Pennsylvania College of Optometry. And he was really on a missionary zeal to sort of educate the countries of the world in optometry about the advances that were possible in therapeutics, particularly. And he made a big influence. And then when I got back, there was a lot of this sort of talk of, I don't know why you want to go down that route. Who wants to be a second-rate ophthalmologist? And I kept saying, no, you've got this wrong. That's not what we're aiming for. What we're aiming for is to be a first-rate optometrist. And that really hit home in the first kind of 2 or 3 weeks of the COVID lockdown, where our practice, along with the local Specsavers as well, to be fair, where we both had IP residents, we were invited to be the divert destination for A&E in our local area. And it was funded by the NHS at that time. And we ultimately published on what we'd done in the 6 months of that scheme, where we had taken 90% of the acute presentations and basically diagnosed and treated them to completion of 90% of the people who walked through the door. The only 10% we didn't were active corneal ulcers, or somebody did an anti-VEGF injection, or was a retinal tear. And it just demonstrated to me that, we had arrived. We've tried to stay there, but the fragmentation of the English NHS is just a saddening thing that it has never, ever quite got back to that level and it doesn't exist at all in some areas, does it? Northampton's a bit of a
No,
desert.
mate, we're about to get mechs.
Oh my goodness. And if you want me to get into my high horse, the whole concept of MEX, well, what does M stand for? It stands for minor. Well, a patient with a sore eye caused by blepharitis or a corneal ulcer doesn't know whether it's minor or major. So urgent eye care service, absolutely fine, and you might deal with it in different ways. But to label it as MEX is an absolute dumbing down. Strongly believe that all the political powers that argue for that should never use that title. It's seminologically wrong.
Yep. And but that, again, that's a whole other talk on your opinions, and actually a lot of the public's opinion on these kind of services.
So let me tell you,
that meant to have rolled out, but never did.
Yeah. Let me tell you another thing about Australian experience that I think did colour my judgment when I came back, and that was it was at the time for ophthalmologists who were members of the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Ophthalmology, the RANSCO. It was written into their constitution that they were not to take part in educating optometrists. So there were one or two who had trained in the UK and worked in Australia and didn't have that degree of kind of prejudice. But by and large, the degree of integration in terms of disease training was non-existent. And so what that meant was that the optometrists had to teach themselves. And the teaching that came through within the University of Melbourne from the likes of David Coburn, Ian Guttridge, John Nathan, John Slack, there were a number of individuals who were supremely good at teaching eye disease to optometrists. And the fundamental thing about teaching disease to optometrists is we're working largely in a primary care setting. So we see the things well before their textbook. It's not like the pictures in Kansky. It's earlier than that. It's more subtle than that. And it always used to annoy me that whenever you asked a question in an ophthalmology lecture about, well, I had this patient with this, what should I do? And the answer always came, well, if you've got any concerns, you should just refer. And I would think, yeah, and I know you're going to be the first that's going to complain that your clinics is full of people that have been referred that didn't need to be referred because somebody couldn't make a decision. And I just thought that was a cop-out, to be honest. So when I came back, I was determined that we had to lift our game in terms of what we were doing for clinical education, in particular in the areas of teaching ophthalmology, teaching disease, and disease as it was relevant to primary care. And that led to establishing an organization, Optometric Educators. It spun off from meetings with Lou Catania at a time where powers that be simply weren't interested in developing that. And we definitely had the door shut in our face by a number of people who I think they're not here anymore. It's unfair to say by name, but we had to do a certain amount of agitation. And that's where the Australian tall poppy syndrome came in. And it's partly spun out of all those days back in Bristol with Fred Giltro Tyler, who was somebody also that taught me to question authority. It wasn't a case of do this, how high would I jump? It's a case of, well, why? Can you explain that to me?
And I think the questioning our US colleagues have done very well. Obviously, they've had their ongoing situation with ophthalmology in the US and their competitiveness, and optometrists not really.
They have, but again, on the ground, when you go to the main science meetings, something like Arvo, for example, people are speaking as equals, and I think that's really important.
But the flip side of that, mate, is if you go to, we're not allowed to go to the American Academy of Ophthalmology meetings.
No.
Right?
But we are allowed to go to our Royal College of Ophthalmology. In fact, I've spoken there and I've had invited chaired sessions there. So much more welcoming.
Yeah. And I think the US, in terms of their petitioning and going to local government to increase scope of practice, is something that they did really well with, most states now being pretty. I mean, when I left, there were only a couple of states that couldn't do glaucoma and stuff, and I think that's all been resolved now. Some with injectables, some with laser, depending on the population
Yeah, it's interesting because
density.
when we got devolution, and I remember having these conversations with the likes of Donald Cameron, Frank Monroe, and Lynn Hansford and Dick Roberts down in Cardiff. What I was basically saying was, look, if you take the US model, the sort of federal model, it was perfectly possible to carve out different structures, different scopes of practice in areas that were where it was particularly applicable. So the first states that really got into primary care optometry were the underpopulated ophthalmology states, the Oklahomas, the Arkansas, etc. And when you looked at the spread of ophthalmologists in Wales and in Scotland, they were based heavily around the main city centres, and whereas optometrists were much more out on the ground. So the potential scope with devolution to develop an entirely different system was really always going to happen. And I was really pleased to see that it did. It's just disappointing that NHS England has never really got that far. But I think the other interesting thing is that, of course, you have to have a wider understanding. It's not just optics. It's not just optometry. It's also a wider understanding of things like primary legislation. So, primarily in the UK, our law is, unless it specifically prohibits you from doing something, you can do something. Whereas, say, European law is very much coded in terms of what you can and can't do.
Okay.
That means that once you've gone over a particular threshold, and the threshold may be independent prescribing, or it may be using injectables or laser, once you cross that threshold, the door is open. So to those of us who've got that far, and you've done a training course in laser, and I'm using YAG lasers now, we're practicing at the same highest level scope of practice as those practitioners are in places like Oklahoma, Arkansas, whatever. It's just late in the game that we're starting to spread that down into the newer generations. And I've always been one where I really want to see the ladder extended to the new qualifying people. I'm 67 now. I know people who are, 10 and 15 years younger than me, who are candle holding for the next generation. But are there a sufficient cohort of people coming through in their 30s and 40s? There certainly are at university level, certainly are in terms of the PhDs that are going through, the level of research that's being done by our colleagues who are younger. But is that entirely translating into a plethora of people in general practice who are trained to that level? And, I just think back to people that were young when I was going through, the likes of Lyndon Jones, James Wolfson, etc. And of course, every year I get older, they get older too.
Yeah.
Where's everybody else coming from?
It is an interesting thought, and there are people coming through. Maybe we don't know them. Maybe they're hanging around in their own little circles. We will see. Only time will tell. I'm just, I'm a little bit younger than yourself, so you do see these very capable, intelligent optometrists doing things day to day, and they are more and more so prepared to share and
So
to teach.
back in September, I went along on a course at Heathrow that was run through the TAEA organization. And, since they set up as an organization with the great products, Higher Back, Blephoclean, etc., back in 2008, I had a very close linkage with them, went to this educational meeting, and pretty much bar about two speakers, they were people I didn't know. But what they were actually doing in terms of independent prescribing was absolutely top end, cutting edge. I can't remember the lady's name, but she was an absolutely amazing optometrist from the Western Ophthalmic. And the sort of presentation she was giving was absolutely excellent. So there is scope for that. And I just hope these people can develop that level of education, and that whether it be the LOCs or whether it be the BCLA or the college, when they are running training courses, they're bringing these people in as speakers. Not me, not you, not Brian. People that have been seen for years. We need that new blood coming through.
I totally agree with you, and I think and you've seen it when I do my CPD event, we're trying to bring new faces, because we are old faces and we are basically singing the same message. You need new people doing it. You need diverse people doing it to show that it doesn't matter what your ethnic background, gender, whatever, sex, it doesn't matter what that is. If you have an interest in it, if you're good at it, you can really develop, progress, and you can help your peers develop and inspire them to be better professionals. So, dude, we've cracked, we're at 43 minutes, and I told you we're going to go. So there are a couple of things just ever so quickly. So you came back, how long before you bought into BBR and kind of started that?
Okay, I arrived back in, I pretty much took the whole of 86 off. I went up and climbed Kilimanjaro. I backpacked through Africa, hung around Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, did a few different kind of hitchhiking across Botswana and stuff like that. So I didn't really start going back to work until probably 87, 88. I was living in Cardiff at the time. That's where I met Linda, got married. And then it was a case of, well, what are we going to do? And I thought I might have inklings into an academic career as a teaching clinician. But unfortunately, that coincided with, again, different individuals at head of school, and also with a change in emphasis in the university sector under the research assessment exercise, where you got star ratings based on your research. And to use a football analogy, one of the things that was happening were lecturers with really good, strong publishing histories were being brought into, they were moved from one university to the next. And unlike football, they could carry their goals with them. So that boosted the RAE for that particular university. So it looked to me like I wasn't going to have the opportunity of an academic career. I hadn't progressed from master's to PhD at that stage. And to a certain extent, I was a little bit kind of, if I want to be a clinician in front of patients, how important is it to be a PhD educator? And I was questioning whether it really was, but unfortunately, you're not going to move in the academic environment of the 80s without that. And we saw a practice. It's funnily enough, there were a number of colleagues that I'd met in Australia and in the US who'd come over for a very early WCO or IWOL meeting in Cardiff. And I was sitting next to somebody who said, "Oh, there's a practice going up in Hereford. It's, you might be interested in that. It's only 50 miles up the road, so we could commute and make a move up there." So I landed in Hereford in September 1990. And I walked through the door, and here was a practice that had been set up by a husband and wife team who were well known in the professions. Angela Bishop, particularly in terms of pediatrics, putting pediatrics on the map. But when I went into those consulting rooms, every room had a Perkins tonometer, every room had a phoropter, every room had a monocular indirect ophthalmoscope, and every room had a really good slit lamp. And it was like walking into the top line clinics in Melbourne. And it was not like any other optometry practice I'd walked into in any other part of the country. Now, I'm sure there were, because I think back in those days, I'm pretty sure Brian had a Nikon slit lamp and was taking really good photographs. So, they weren't the only ones, but it was rare. And what I felt was, by joining this practice, I was going to be able to demonstrate that I could tick the clinical boxes with being commercially successful. Because for years and years and years, as a profession, we've been told you can either be retail and make money, or you can be clinical. But at the end of the day, if you don't make money selling glasses, you're never going to be able to develop the profession as you would like. And we have put our practice in a position where we're probably 40 to 45% of the income of the practice is coming from fees for chair time. And that isn't just the optometrists, that's the CLOs, that's the low vision practitioners as well. So I think that proved to me that it was perfectly capable of, yeah, it's great to see good appliances. It's great to see great dispensing. The dispensing teams, I've never denigrate that. But you don't have to rely on just price point advertising of
Yep.
glasses
Yep.
to do a really first-rate job.
Quick question about that then, ever so quick. How long did that take you to kind of make that transition? Or was that something that was already there and you just developed it a bit further?
It was already there and I developed it further. I mean, I'd come in
Yeah.
with a master's degree, so I could plot graphs. I could see how, all we did was we put pound signs on the graphs, and it just, taught us how to do things. I did a finance course, sort of a night school type of finance course to understand how to read a balance sheet and stuff like that. And if you think about it, in 1989 was when the GOS was privatized. People were going to have to pay for their eye exams. The then Minister of Health was going around saying, well, optometrists can basically give the eye exams for nothing. Can you make the money on the glasses? The profession, to its credit, almost universally told them where to go off, and fees were charged. But at that time, you were getting something like £7.18, £8 for an NHS sight test. People were talking about £9.50 or £10 for an eye exam. And the partners that I joined 2 years later in 91, their ethos was to go around and find out what every other practice was charging and then charge 20 to 30% more. Okay. So when everybody else is charging £9.50, they were charging 15. And the basic argument to that was, well, we want to differentiate ourselves. We want to reward our clinical care, and we want to put value on it. And that comes full circle because I've just seen that my late practice has carried on that ethos. It's just from the 1st of February, a new set of fees coming out. The only differential we have is that a newly qualified optometrist is charging something of the order of £85 to £90 for a private eye exam. Wow. If you've just qualified, you've done your 4 years, you've got yourself into practice, and that's what your chair time is being valued at. Doesn't that sound right to you? That, it's not just a lost leader of burn through a few ghost clinics, get a few people through the door, let them select their own badly fitting frames. It does happen.
Yeah, it's possible. Right. So we got you in practice. You've done a lot, mate. You've been a college member, college counselor.
I've been a college member ever since day one, even all the time I was in Australia.
And you're honorary fellow now also.
Yeah.
But
that was a reward.
You did college, you were a college counsellor?
No, I've never been on the college council.
Okay.
I've been a GOC counsellor.
Right.
And I happened to join the GOC, again, one of these other chance meetings. Donald Cameron and I were both invited over to Atlanta to present at SECO. Really, really big CE meetings. And if you, as a British optometrist, have never been to an American CE meeting, you do not know what you have missed. So we were sitting there in a Chinese restaurant, and I think one of us said to the other, you do realize that the GOC council elections are coming up next year. Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we both stand? You can stand in Scotland. I'll stand for election in England. We'll see what happens. And we had an aim of getting deeply involved into the whole therapeutics argument. And that was 2001. And by 2005, we had additional supply and supplementary prescribing. By 2008, we had independent prescribing. It wasn't only us, but we were definitely somewhat agitating. And if people think, the way the GOC did it or how the exams work or whatever isn't exactly as everybody would have wanted, well, no, but you should have been there at the time to see how it could develop. It wasn't easy. So yeah, college council, and then optometric educators started to take me around the world. And, the wonderful thing about giving a lecture on in-practice leadership to a group of contact lens practitioners in Buenos Aires, or heading to Medellin in Colombia or Hyderabad, you can't about that. The experiences are just tremendous. If you open the door, you open your eyes to what's out there.
And so how did those opportunities come about? The optometric educators then getting invited abroad. How have you kind of, because I do a bit of lecturing here and there, but mate, I can't get myself invited abroad. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Well, sometimes it was a bit of a taster, and sometimes it worked on the basis that I never saw myself as a 5-day a week practitioner in the practice. So when people kind of said to me in July, "How are you coping with not going in every day?" I said, "Well, I never did. For the last 2 or 3 years, I've only really done 2 to 3 days a week and built the business out of that. So it's always been a portfolio career. And then what I've done is basically taken a look at 1 or 2 meetings and sort of said, well, do you know what? I think that's worth an investment in there. I'm going to pay to go to Copenhagen and speak at the European Academy, the first international meeting they held. And I've been to every one ever since, including being president of the European Academy through COVID, which was a challenge. So you have tasters where you're putting your name out there, and then you get an invite. Would you like to come over? The very first one was something Michel Nilado asked me to do with one of his friends in Florence, in Italy, back in '88, when Linda and I went out to Firenze and Siena, and that was a real starter. So putting myself about a bit, cuddling up to people, and sort of I can be your best friend, and then getting involved with companies that need a speaker. So that was really where a lot of the work with Topcom began.
So I know how I did it, right? How would you say, and this is more for our audience, right? We know how we did it. How would you say is a good way to kind of build those relationships and kind of get yourself friendly with people who do need smart optometrists to speak on their behalf and give them advice and tell them the lay of the land?
Number one thing I would say is be reliable. If say you're going to be there at a particular time, be there at a particular time. If you're borrowing something off someone, and you're going to write up the story about it, make sure you do, and make sure you return it to them. And this happened to me way, way back in '88 when I was teaching in Cardiff, and the very first Volt lens made the market. Nobody in the UK had picked up a Volt lens in optometry. There were a few ophthalmologists using it. And I wrote to this chap called Andy York. He was working for Keylers at the time. And I said, I've heard about this lens from a pal of mine out in Australia, and I think Keylers are marketing Volt lenses. Could you loan me one? And he said, yeah, okay. So he did. And I managed to rig up to get a couple of photographs through a slit lamp eyepiece. We're talking years before digital imaging and stuff. You're waiting for the pictures to come from Dixon sort of thing. And I wrote an article for The Optician in '88, all about, everything to do with, if you're going to dilate the patient, this is how you do a Van Herrick. When you've dilated, this is how you use the Volt lens, et cetera, et cetera. And then, sent the article back to him to say, look, this is what I've done with it. And he said, oh, keep it, keep it for the clinic. And obviously the clinic's still got it. And that started a relationship. But the relationship comes from, borrowing something to say you're going to do something and then doing it, following through. And I think that's kind of important. It's a bit like, if you work in an office and somebody comes to your desk, and say, can I borrow the stapler? And then 2 days later, you're looking for your stapler because it hasn't been returned to you. That degree of reliability is what makes people trust you. And once you've got that level of trust, you will get asked to do things.
Yeah.
And I think
no, go on. I'll let you finish.
So the next thing is to say, if somebody asks you to do something, you say yes. Right? And then you work out how you're going to get there.
Someone else had said that earlier, also say yes. I think for me, the one that has really helped me the most is showing an interest, a genuine interest in someone's product. Having seen something that is available in another part of the world, and then coming across that manufacturer at a conference, BCLA, college or whatever, and going, wow, is that
I
it
mean,
in person? Can I have a real play with it? Can I have a go with it? And that's always stood me in good stead.
that's how my relationship initially with Taya, but more latterly with Scope, was taken off. So I'd come back from one of the American conferences, and we used to go around the American Academy conferences, go around their exhibits hall and their exhibition, pinching stuff off the stands. Obviously, they're giving it to you. But things like CiberVision's lid wipes, they didn't exist in the UK, and brought back a pack of those. And then, I took a phone call from a young woman who'd newly started with Taya back in 2008. And I remember it to this day because I was parked up outside Halfords looking at a trailer to fit to the car to take rubbish to the tip. And the phone went, and it was Helen Street. And it was Helen saying, look, I work for this chap, Philip Lewis Williams, and we've set up Taya, and we've got these products, and we need to bring them to the optometry market. And it was higher back, and it was Bleffer Clean, and it was Bleffer Sol. So they sent us some packages. I wrote it up for the optician. The rest is history. I worked with them and still do for a long time. Transferred over to Scope, and I work with them now and been part of their IP bursary program. But that's part of it. You get trusted to deliver, and there are plenty of other people out there that are delivering these days. So the next generation is there, just needs a bit more encouragement.
2 questions, because we've just cracked an hour. This is going to be my longest episode ever. 2 questions. You've done a lot. You've got a diverse career, mate. I don't think I know possibly anyone whose career has been quite as diverse as yours, with the education, associate professor, taking on students and doing the R&D stuff and stuff like that. What would you say would be a career highlight for you?
I think it might seem a bit prosaic, but the very first time I wrote a prescription for prednisolone acetate for somebody with uveitis, that was through the door, and thinking that 5 years ago, I would have had to either ask the GP to prescribe it on my behalf, and they probably wouldn't have, or I'd have had to send them to a 5-hour wait in A&E. And it's that direct, immediate impact with the patient. And that prescription was written for a patient that had a uveitis who'd come back in post-operatively after having had private cataract surgery. And I rang the surgeon to ask them what would we do. And he wasn't on the golf course, but he was on holiday. And he said, well, you could prescribe now, can't you? I said, yeah. He said, well, go off you go, do it. And that was it. And so that, daft as it may seem, is probably the highlight. And I've never looked back from that.
Yeah, that I have a similar story like that. It's just amazing when you can, that's that real life-changing stuff that we can do. And then just to finish off, mate, what would you give, one piece of advice you'd give an optometrist? Let's say for you, I'm going to make it slightly different. One piece of advice you would give an optometrist who's maybe getting a little bit bored, maybe thinking, is this really the career for me? Let's say for up until now, they've been predominantly stuck in an environment that's very much refract. And we know there are certain models out there that's the biggest emphasis. What advice would you give like a young professional?
The advice I would give is very much around the thing you keep hearing about in the younger generations, the work-life balance. And I think the work-life balance in optometry isn't necessarily from doing fewer days and spending more days on the golf course or working 3 days out of, and on holiday. I would be looking at saying, look, I can make a reasonable income out of this 4-day week or 4.5-day week. I want to go off and spend an afternoon in either a private ophthalmology clinic or in the hospital eye service. Now, I don't think necessarily people ought to work for nothing. I think people ought to be paid for what they do. And, HES sessional rates probably aren't what they're cracked up to be. But the best way of working out whether you fit in with that area, and you might find that they do want to employ you would be to do some voluntary work. And that would be one of the ways in. You would work with these people. You can face to face with the ophthalmologist you're referring your patients to. And it just opens your eyes to a different sort of environment. I mean, we ended up with a practice with 26 staff when I left and 6 staff optometrists. So we could bounce ideas off each other. I think the worst thing is when you've got an environment where you've got one optometrist in one consulting room, in one clinic, that, to be honest, the throughput of patients doesn't give you the economies of scale to get the right levels of equipment into practice to your level of scope and potential. So I think working in that slightly wider environment, if you're a solo practitioner, try and take a day off, try and get yourself into a hospital setting. Or there's an optometry school opening up on practically every high street nowadays in the UK. Go and do some teaching clinics. That would be a great way of helping the new students come through and finding out what you know and what you don't know.
There's nothing like teaching to make you keep you on your toes in terms of where you actually are from a knowledge base. With that, I'd like to thank you ever so much, because I told you, yeah, it'll only be half an hour. We've just now broken an hour, and that's been fantastic and really insightful. I probably could get another hour out of you, Nick, to be honest. And now you're retired, I might even try it if
don't
some
find
of the
something else to talk about.
Yeah.
But give somebody like me a chance to talk about themselves for an hour. I'm not exactly going to shut up.
Well, I did warn you at the beginning, but I didn't control it very well. So I'm going to say thank you very much, and take care. And I will probably see you, I guess, I don't know, will you do 100% this year?
I think I
social?
might do. There's a couple of things on in London I wouldn't mind seeing. I regretted last year with 100%. It was the F1 show was in the same Excel, and I missed it by a day. And so I'm going to have a good look around. There's a couple of really good photographic exhibitions on in London. There's a couple of shows. So, and my daughter lives 20 minutes away from Excel, so it's certainly on the cards. But we're moving house sometime soon, and I'm not allowed to book really anything except really short notice, just in case.
Fair enough. All right, mate. Thank you very much. You take care. You have a lovely evening, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, cheers, Kenneth. I'll leave now. Bye.